Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. This is the podcast that delves into the intricate world of global politics, the past and present, while also exploring potential possibilities for what tomorrow could bring. I'm your host, Dylan, and in each episode here of the Geopolitics Explained podcast, we'll break down complex issues into small, understandable chunks through in-depth scenario analysis. So come and join us as we navigate the ever-changing landscape of international relations, uncovering the stories behind the headlines and predicting trends that could shape the future of our world. There's one country currently in geopolitics that seemingly can't keep themselves out of the news. That country, and the country that we're going to discuss in today's episode, is France. Now, for many years, France has been losing influence in the Sahel region in Africa that it used to have colonial control over. As a result of France losing influence, Russia and Turkey have been two of the states who have gained from France's declining influence. However, the second-order consequences of these changes don't stop there. We see France supplying Armenia with weapons to use in its current border conflict against Azerbaijan. Then, even further afield, as I discussed a few weeks ago in a written piece over on Substack, we've seen the French overseas territory of New Caledonia in the Pacific. We've seen riots over there in New Caledonia, and some people were waving the flag of Azerbaijan. Now, this is all connected. We'll dive into that in today's episode. We've also, as an effect of France losing influence in the Sahel, we've seen them withdraw many of their troops, especially from Niger. And we've also seen the same of US troops. Now, another reason France has been in the news quite a lot recently is the EU elections, the results of which caused Macron to announce snap elections in France. This led to issues in the French bond market, which we'll also dive into today. Now, as discussed in the intro, France is very quickly losing influence in the Sahel region in Africa. Now, this has been demonstrated through a series of coups that have occurred since 2020. We've seen two coups in Mali occurring in August 2020 and May 2021. One in Sudan in October 2021. We saw one in Burkina Faso in January 2022, and again in September 2022. Then we saw one in Niger in July 2023, and one in Gabon in August 2023. Now, one thing in common between all these states is that they were former French colonies. And it's clear that these countries are rejecting the French and how involved they are in the affairs of these countries. Now, throughout the years of colonialism, many of these nations who were enacting the colonialism exploited these countries, especially in Africa, for their resources. One such example of this that was occurring until recently is Niger and its uranium supply. Now, France losing influence in the Sahel is clear, based on the fact that after the coup in Niger, a few months later, in November 2023, we saw French leader Emmanuel Macron head to Kazakhstan, who possesses the largest uranium mining company in the world, Kazatomprom. And we saw Macron seeking alternative supplies of uranium. One aspect of the French losing influence in the Sahel is that other nations are trying to gain the influence that the French are losing. Those countries are Russia and Turkey. Now, Russia's gain of influence in the Sahel is slightly more easy to see than the influence of the Turks, so we'll start there. The Wagner Group, for many years in Africa, aimed to upend stability and supported any instability, especially through the coups that I listed earlier. Now, the Wagner Group also provides security for some of the projects for the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, but it's clear that Wagner has quite the influence in the Sahel. In April this year, if it couldn't be any clearer that Russia was gaining influence and being accepted by the countries in the Sahel, a Russian plane arrived in the capital of Niger, Niamey. It was reported that this plane was carrying military trainers and equipment and a Russian air defense system. Niger have also recently ousted French troops and American troops. Now, when it comes to Turkey, trade between Turkey and Africa has increased massively over the years, especially in the last 2 decades. Trade 20 years ago between Turkey and Africa amounted to $5.4 billion. In 2022, this had risen to over $40 billion. One reason that the Turks decided to gain influence in Africa is also interestingly related back to France. In 2018, French leader Emmanuel Macron told Turkish leader Erdogan that there was no chance that Turkey would ever join the EU. Macron has been quite a big proponent in pushing that Turkey would never be able to join the EU. So as a result, Turkey turned to Africa. They improved trade relations with many African countries, and now they're also becoming a major security partner of many African countries. So again, as will be a running theme in this episode, it comes back to France and Emmanuel Macron. If somebody is to make a move against a country geopolitically, we often see responses from the country that has suffered at the hands of another. So, of course, the French are going to respond to the declining influence in the Sahel. They're attempting to do this in the Caucasus, specifically by supplying weapons to Armenia. Now, Armenia is embroiled in a border war with Azerbaijan. However, many are predicting, including me, that this border war is going to die down, especially this year, because Azerbaijan is hosting the COP event later this year in November. We've also recently seen the Nagorno-Karabakh aspect of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan end, with Azerbaijan taking control of the territory. We also saw Armenia recently return 4 villages to Azerbaijan. So it's very clear that Azerbaijan is in the driver's seat. Now, one reason for this is Russian peacekeepers were supposed to uphold the peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, especially in Nagorno-Karabakh. when the Azeris made their moves against Nagorno-Karabakh, the Russian peacekeepers did very little. This has seen Armenia sour towards Russia, and they've turned to the west. One country who has answered these calls is, of course, the French, who have sent weapons to Armenia in the past, and just this week sent Armenia a bunch of howitzers. However, this doesn't stop here. It still spreads further afield. In a written blog piece over on Substack a few weeks ago, I discussed the Pacific island of New Caledonia, which is a French overseas territory. There were riots occurring here. Now, if you want more information on this, I recommend heading over to Substack and reading the blog. But the important aspect of it is many of the rioters were seen waving the flags of Azerbaijan. Now, this doesn't specifically mean that the Azeris are directly involved in the riots in New Caledonia, but why would an island in the Pacific wave the flag of another country that's at the other side of the world to it? It's clear that something's going on here, and I think it's involved in these tit-for-tat moves that the French are making. So we'll remain interested in this topic, in the relations between France and Russia, and how the French's moves in the Caucasus, attempting to rival Russia, has also brought the Azeris and the Armenians into it. The French have also been one of the loudest voices when it comes to support for Ukraine, and they've even discussed sending French troops to Ukraine to train the Ukrainians within the country. This is another way that the French are trying to rival the Russians in this geopolitical rivalry that the French and the Russians currently have going on. Now, it remains to be seen if this happens or not. The French are, of course, part of NATO, which we've discussed in the past. This would raise the risk of accidents, which could drag NATO and other countries into a more active role in this conflict. Many others in the French parliament, including Marine Le Pen, who is leader of the opposition, have stated that they wouldn't send French troops directly to Ukraine, which is the policy that Macron has been heavily pushing in recent months. This gets us on to the second big topic of today's episode, which is the elections in the EU Parliament and the after effects caused from the results in the EU Parliament, which have led to a French snap election. The European Parliament is one of the legislative bodies of the European Union, and with the Council of the European Union, it's them who adopt any European legislation. Now, earlier this month, we saw the European Parliament host elections for its now 720 seats, which are rising from 705 before the election. And this parliamentary election saw some big changes. Importantly, if we look at the votes and the seats by country, Emmanuel Macron is part of the Renew party, which gained 13 of the 81 seats that France holds in the European Parliament. The Identity and Democracy group gained 30 seats, which is the largest number of seats of the French French cohort of 81 seats. The Identity and Democracy group includes French opposition leader Marine Le Pen. Now, the Identity and Democracy group overall in the elections gained 9 seats, and the Renew Europe group, including Emmanuel Macron, lost 21 seats. The Renew group still has more, holding 81 total seats out of the 720, versus the 58 held by the Identity and Democracy group, including Marine Le Pen. But it was a huge loss for Macron, and it's led to him calling snap elections in France. The upcoming French elections will elect the 577 seats in the French National Assembly, and will also elect a new Prime Minister. Now, in 2022, Macron failed to secure a majority, but it's looking like he's not going to be in a more advantageous position now. He also didn't need to call these legislative elections. There was no vote due until 2027, which is when Macron's second term will end. Now, some have said that Macron is aiming to play some political chess here. He likely knows that his party won't gain a majority in these elections. In fact, they're sitting third in the polls, behind Le Pen's far-right National Rally and a new left-wing alliance. But some are saying that Macron is aiming to let a far-right government take the reins in the hopes that they're not successful, and this will weaken their chances in the 2027 presidential election, when Macron won't be able to run due to term limits. The elections work in a 2-round system, with any candidate who receives over 50% in the first round and greater than 25% of the total registered electorate will receive that seat. If this doesn't happen, then there's a runoff between the top 2 candidates or any other candidate who receives above 12.5% of the registered electorate. Now, 289 seats are needed for a majority, and the latest polling occurred 2 days ago by a group called Harris Interactive. I'll include the link to the PDF down below. There was a sample size of 2,263 people, and the polls placed Le Pen's National Rally at 33%, the left-wing alliance New Popular Front at 26%, and Macron's Together coalition at 21%. Now, when it comes to seats, this still means that no party would achieve a majority, with Le Pen's National Rally predicted between 220 and 250 seats. The left-wing alliance New Popular Front predicted between 135 and 165 seats, and Macron's Together coalition predicted between 95 and 130 seats. You actually have to go back to March 2023 for Macron's coalition to have more seats projected than the far-right National Rally. Now, it's worth noting that polls can differ from the results. In India, Modi was predicted a strong majority. That's not worked out for him. He's got no majority, and he's going to have to form a coalition. But the important thing here is that this is a big gamble from Macron. If he is playing some political chess, I guess we'll see in 2027, but based on these current elections, it's not looking particularly good for Macron's Together coalition. The strategy that Macron's Together alliance is seemingly going for in attempts to discredit Marine Le Pen's National Rally or the left-wing alliance is one of a financial aspect. The French finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, warned last week that if either of these groups are to gain power in the French National Assembly, that France could fall into a debt crisis due to higher public spending. Now, we saw what this did to Liz Truss in the UK when she proposed her autumn spending bill. She didn't last much longer in the position of Prime Minister after that. British bond yields soared, and many pension funds feared that they wouldn't be able to pay out pensions, and so something had to change, and Liz Truss stepped down as Prime Minister. The same thing is feared in France, and it's caused French bond yields to spike. Now, it remains to be seen how this pans out, but as we saw in the UK, it does have the power to affect things politically. The bond market in any country is one that needs to remain stable. If the bond market leg collapses, your currency collapses and political stability collapses. So in this French election, I'd recommend keeping one eye on the bond market. That's everything that I wanted to cover on France today. Going forward, in the short term, watch out for the French election results and the effects that this could have on the French bond yields and the bond markets in general. On a longer term, more geopolitical view, I'd recommend keeping an eye on how France acts towards the Ukraine war, especially based on the results in the French election. And I'd also keep up to date on any potential developments between the French and Azerbaijan, and the French and the Russians and the Turks. Lots to focus on. I hope this gives a lot of food for thought. This has been another episode of the Geopolitics Explained podcast. I want to thank you all for listening. I greatly appreciate it. If you enjoyed this episode, why not leave a review on the podcast platform of your choice? And if you want more content like this, we write over on Substack. You can find the link for this in the description. Once again, I've been Dylan. Until next time, signing off.